Thank you all. If you're just tuning in to the Indigenous Protocols in Public Art panel discussion, my name is Belinda Uwase, and I'm the Artist Programs Coordinator for STEPS Public Art. If you're unfamiliar with our work, STEP fosters dynamic and inclusive communities through public art and creative placemaking. We transform urban spaces into vibrant places through cultural planning, community arts, and artist capacity building programming. Just a quick note for Zoom and accessibility. We do have closed captioning, so if you would like to utilize that, you can see the CC icon on your Zoom toolbar for subtitle settings. We also have ASL interpretation by Jordan and Tessa, and they are spotlighted, but feel free to also pin them to your screen for easy access if you so need. We also will be taking questions at the end of our conversation tonight, so please keep those until the end, but feel free to also pop them into the chat and we'll get to them when we can. So yeah, thank you all again for making the time and tuning into this panel discussion. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And before we start our discussion tonight, I would just like to begin as STEPS wishes to acknowledge the sacred land on which we're meeting today and that we operate out of. It has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. The territories include the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and the Métis Nation. The territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and Allied Nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes, taking only what is needed and ensuring the dish is never left empty for others. Today, the meeting place of Te Toronto is the home to a large, active, and diverse urban Indigenous community from many nations across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to use this land to share ideas and generate creativity. As a public arts organization, we recognize our privilege in working on stolen and unceded lands, and are working to unlearn colonial structures. We encourage everyone to learn about the lands that we call home and about the Indigenous communities we share this land with today, as well as those that came before us. Nativeland.ca is a great resource and starting point to help learn about the traditional Indigenous territories that we currently reside in, as well as the treaties, communities, and languages. And we will link that in the chat as well. Again, thank you everyone for joining. I'm really excited for this conversation, and I will start it off by passing it off to each speaker to introduce themselves, and then we'll just go right into it. So firstly, Lindsey, if you could introduce yourself.
Okay, Ani Bojo, Sego, Scano, Mushkikini, Bitcoin, Dishnakas, Mizikindodem, Six Nations, Misagikindunjaba. What I said to you in one of my languages is my name that creation calls me, which translates to medicine water. And I am Turtle Clan, and I'm mixed Ongohowe Anishinaabe. And I'm currently speaking to you from Six Nations of the Grand River. And I also have family ties to the Mississaugas of Credit First Nation. I guess just to tell a little bit about kind of how I've come to be on this panel and come to know the work of STEPS. I've been on the Indigenous Advisory Council for STEPS for just over a year now, and have worked going on 4 years working within animating parks, as well for the From Weeds We Grow programming, which is essentially bringing conversations to urban spaces around reconciliation, land acknowledgement, and how to build better relationships with Indigenous folks, specifically within the arts. I'm also, of course, an artist, independent, as well as a advocate. I also work for the Ontario Native Women's Association as a community safety liaison, specifically helping to build capacity in the province for people who are doing frontline work, supporting Indigenous women primarily in exiting exploitative situations. So I'm very honored to be here and looking forward to the conversation. Miigwech. Now.
Amazing. Thank you, Lindsey. I'll pass it off to Eli next to introduce themselves.
Hello, everybody. Tansei Nitotamak, Eli Hirtle Nisi Kosan. My name is Eli Hirtle. I'm Nehio on my mother's side from Big Stone Nation, a place called Wabasca, Northern Alberta, and a mix of European on my father's side, primarily German and British. I'm joining you today from Lekwungen territory, now known as Victoria, BC, where I was born and raised. As a diasporic Nehio person who grew up on the West Coast, I'm often thinking about place. I was just back home in Alberta visiting family and friends a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, before this conversation, preparing for today, I was thinking about my relationships to those two places as an artist, as a filmmaker, as a curator. Those are hats I wear at different times. I've been working with STEPS through my previous role, which I just left at Open Space Art Society, where I served for the past 5 years as curator, Indigenous and Contemporary Arts. And I'm just about to begin a new position as director of programming with the Indigenous Curatorial Collective. And so a big part of my work is thinking through our protocols and practices, displaying arts in galleries, but also in public spaces of all kinds. Tomorrow I'll be doing a walk with some other artists who are commissioned to make augmented reality works here on the Lekwungen territory, site-specific works. So I'll probably talk a little bit about that today, my experience as an artist, but also as a curator and somebody who helps support artists realize their work in all kinds of spaces.
Amazing. Thank you, Eli. And last but not least, Tiffany, if you could introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the invite. I'm Tiffany Shaw, and my family is Métis. We come from Fort McMurray via Fort Mackay and the Red River, though I was born in Calgary and raised in Edmonton, so you can kind of choose whichever hockey team you like. And my understanding around being Métis is through architecture and through art and public art. So I am a registered architect here in Alberta and in BC. And most of my practice revolves around ways to bring my family together to a better place. And so it mostly revolves around what my great-grandmother and my grandmother and my mother and my brothers and my children and my brother's children are in their circles that they operate. I'm also part of a collective called Otetse One Contemporary Art Collective, and we have an art center running out of Edmonton. We opened up a building in 2020. And so I'm a core member of that organization that Becca Taylor directs, which does a beautiful job. And I wear a few other hats. I'm on a few boards recently. So the Dalhousie Architecture Press is a new venture. And I'm also on the advisory board for the Agnes Reimagined. And typically I don't join boards because I don't enjoy the top-down structures, whereas the core membership that we have is making decisions around consensus. So I'm just sort of looking into those new ventures to see what other kind of platforms exist for Indigenous people in those spaces around writing and culture. So yeah, that's the work that I do.
Amazing. Thank you all. I'm really excited. I'm going to go and jump right into the questions. Really looking forward to the conversation. And the first question, to kind of give us some base understanding of where we're coming from in terms of this discussion on protocols, is what is protocol in this context, and how does it differ in your own personal experience within the public art sphere and how you approach your work.
You should ask Lindsey.
I know everyone's like, who's gonna go first? I can break the ice. So I think for my practice, because I'm involved in a lot of the governance aspects and policy as well, as Tiffany mentioned, the top-down structure, that definitely I can relate to that. But so I have a really interesting combination of my own practice combined with understanding policy, dealing with policy, governance, and then also on top of that, which I didn't mention in my intro, it's in the bio, is also my experience as an Ashkabewis, so as a ceremonial helper. And I've been doing that work for 13 years now. And I think one of the things that sticks out for me is, and I think it's getting better recently from what I've seen, is this understanding of intersectionality, right? I know when I first started as an artist, I got a lot of comments from people within, the mainstream art industry, basically asking me to focus, right? So actually being critical about the intersectional nature of kind of who I am, essentially, right? And that was really kind of eye-opening for me to just show the contrast of, how people approach creating, generally, and then how Indigenous people approach creating, at least from my own experience. And that was also pretty common among my peers and mentors as well, and people that kind of came before me, is this, constant challenge of, I guess, having to carve out space for all of those elements of who we are, right? And I think also over the last 10 years, reconciliation conversations have changed a lot of the dynamics as well. And so when I think of protocol, my mind goes to a lot of different places. And it's also dependent on the approaches, what the space is, and kind of what hats you're wearing, right? And what your goals are. So I know for myself as well, even just seeing the evolution of, say, the mainstream sector, even to the extent of, like, say, public art as an example, installation work, or even working with corporate entities, right? It's changed in the sense of there's a recognition that the process of how we create is different, right? Even ideas of time, right? Because another thing too that was kind of absent in the conversation, that's changed now, but back then was the idea that creation takes time. And that's another piece that's kind of something that we have to grapple with as artists, just generally, but as Indigenous artists as well, is this concept of time, timelines, when to get things done. So I would say, there's more understanding that we tend to work in different ways. We approach creating differently, and there's an understanding happening of that, although we have a lot of things that we have to work out that are still challenges, right? I'm not going to go too in depth with it because I know there's other questions, but when I think of protocol, I think about that allowing of a different way, an acknowledgement of creative process that includes all of those elements of what make Indigenous people us.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really like your point of, like, what your goal is as well. I think that definitely changes a lot of how open you are to in taking all of those different approaches or, like, lenses and protocol, as if you have a goal of genuinely implementing an Indigenous approach, you have to also have that as, like, the forefront of, like, the beginning of the public art process or whatever it is that you're trying to create. So yeah, I think that's important. anyone can feel free to jump in, or I can follow people.
Eli, you go.
You want me to go? Okay,
Yeah.
I like the light right now. I've got a little disco ball above my head, and I've got these lights shining down on me. Maybe it's a little spotlight. Yeah, thanks so much, Lindsey, for sharing all of that. I think maybe a good starting point for me, what stood out from what you just said was bringing all of the different aspects of ourselves into this work. And when I was just back home, being able to be an oskapiao, or a ceremonial helper, at the ceremony I attended, it reminded me of how important it is for us to work together on projects, whether they're art projects, just community projects, ceremony. And so I think a starting point for me in almost every kind of project, whether that's film or exhibitions in galleries or public art, is conversation, consultation, engagement. I don't think that there's any set protocols. I mean, there could be in a pan-Indigenous sense, but when I think of how diverse and different our communities are, and what it feels like for me to be Nahio on Lekwungen territory, on Coast Salish territory, and how I walk on these lands and conduct work here. My starting point when I was invited to create a site-specific piece of work last year here was to talk to a friend of mine who I had filmed with about Kwetlau, the Camas food system, a traditional food system that was used for trade, and as a staple food item for the Lekwungen people. And I wanted to make a piece of work about that. And so I worked with my friend Cheryl, whose family is responsible for stewarding that within their territory, for her to speak to the importance of that food. And I beaded a camas flower, a Kwetlau flower, which we were able to then recreate on the land, a place where the Kwetlau is coming back, so that when you step into the area and trigger the AR app, there's Kwetlau all around your feet, and you hear Cheryl talking about the importance of that food. So to me, that was a really important part of the project. I wouldn't have felt comfortable just talking about it or making work about a food system that was not traditionally mine. Now, if I go back home and I do work in Wabasca, that would look very different. Another project that I'm starting to work on is with the Vancouver Aboriginal Friendship Society, the Friendship Center in Vancouver, MST territories. And I'm going to be an art mentor on that project and work closely with the public art project manager on a pretty large social housing project. So what I've been stressing with the different, I guess, stakeholders on that project is the importance of somebody from the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh communities being the project manager, and a full and robust consultation and engagement with the urban Indigenous community and host nations on what kind of work we're going to be doing for that building, inside and outside. So I think, yeah, thinking about goals is incredibly important, audiences, but I always go back to the importance of these engagement sessions, taking the time that they need to take. It's this interesting balancing act, navigating and negotiating timelines. Whether it's a municipality or a corporation or a company or a gallery, we all have timelines and deadlines, but sometimes these conversations take longer. So I think that's an important part of this process, is talking through the importance of the necessary conversations taking place.
Congrats on your job, by the way. That's really exciting. That's very exciting to see what you'll do there. Thank you for talking about those things, because I also agree it really just depends, like, in the context of what you're in, because so I'm talking from Amaskwaci again, or Edmonton. There's also the Métis Nation of Alberta now has a new territorial map. So I'm in North Saskatchewan River Territory. But there are several different Indigenous groups in these areas. And if we just talk about from a Cree perspective, for example, it really depends on the type of project you open up. There's not like one specific Cree way. And when I'm on building projects, for example, there seems to be either a all business or a very ceremonial approach, or sometimes in between. So it's nice to know that there's not one way of doing things. That's what I always love about it. It always, whenever I come to a project, I'm always knowing that protocol has to be done, and just modeling around us, what is the protocol to follow, and not usually the one that instigates the protocol, I find, in these projects. So that's nice to just be in a space of listening rather than delivering. Because I love this concept around protocol so much, because it's often guided around opening up in a good way, and making sure that when you're opening up in a good way, you're creating offerings either to the spirits or for guidance or for the group or for the vision. There's just an offering of some kind, an exchange of gifting that you're not extracting. And I also find that it's about honoring the voices who are a part of the conversation. Sometimes it's past or present or future. So what I love about protocols, it kind of gives you a sense of rehoming yourself in the conversation rather than just running from one meeting to the next. So our protocol for this session, for example, was to talk about where we're from. So we all talked about who we were, but, you know, for example, I'm like, oh, darn, I forgot to say what my family connection was, because that's protocol. People need to know how they're related to me. So I should also mention that my family is from the Toronto line, because people want to know how we connect with each other. That's really critical in Indigenous spaces. And we all have our own protocols just in working too, like introductions is an easy one, but I also find it around rituals, which is also lovely to create intention. So when I'm working in projects by myself, though, I have to create my own protocol. So for public art, it can also be a seemingly silent operation. But what I did with one project I'm working with the town of Banff on a public art piece there, my protocol was to ask the river surrounding what it wanted me to do. That was my protocol, which was to confer with my ancestors around me on what they want, not just what I want, because we don't operate in a vacuum. But there's some pretty amazing people in this room, like Thema, for example. She uses potlatch methodology in their processes, and that's amazing protocol around nourishment and quite inspiring, that I love to always kind of listen to and see how they exhibit that in their work. So they use protocol as part of process in their artwork as well, but that's also interesting too. I talked a little longer than I wanted to, sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate, Eli, you starting that off around conversations and consultations and just community engagement. I think that really opens up in a good way, as Tiffany mentioned as well. I think that's a good way to have these protocols kind of just like on our space and time. And if you have those goals of genuinely making sure that the public art process is informed, being able to have those discussions with community is really important. So yeah, thank you for all your thoughts. This kind of leads into the next question as well, on how organizations or institutions can ensure that they have the capacity to take on these protocols genuinely. I think this is important in terms of making sure that you honor the time and have the space to actually put in the work that's required to do this work in a non-performative way as well. So yeah, I would really like to hear your thoughts on that.
So what sticks out to me in that question is the non-performative piece, which I think is something it's becoming a standard, right? Which I think is amazing, and definitely something we've needed for a long time. But in that, I think what I've seen from organizations, again, working with a broad spectrum of people, the way that I've noticed, the best way to kind of gauge capacity is if you can listen, right? You can be open to listen. You can also be open to learning, right? Because listening and learning aren't always succinct. And then also too, being okay with the potential for mistakes to be made, right? And being able to take that accountability in that process. And I think that too leads itself in a round circle back to that protocol piece. And I agree with my peers here, right? Like it is very nation specific whenever we approach projects. And it has to be, because that's the way that we are, right? As Indigenous people. We're very nation specific, we're very land specific, right? In connection to whatever that land base is. And also, in that, just recognizing that there's going to be a learning curve, but I think there's that, if the willingness is there, right, and the openness, and then again the willingness to be and integrate some of those protocols, but also too, like, recognizing that we can't pan-indigenize. But I do know that one thing that's kind of a constant is this undercurrent that we all have of natural law, right? And how we actually interact with each other. So I really love that was mentioned before, is that getting away from extractive practices, which really are colonial practices, right? And starting to come back to that place of reciprocity, because that's what's inherent in a lot of the natural law from nation to nation. That's something that's, commonly where we can meet in the middle and understand. So if a stakeholder can come to that understanding and understand the importance of that, that's a really great first step of going down that process of meaningfully engaging and walking the talk, right? And building the capacity, because that's the other part of it, is that recognizing that in terms of the time and space that we are, not getting into like quantum science talk, right? Because that's a whole other conversation of the concept of time. But in terms of our timeline, right, we are at a place where we haven't been before. So we are actually co-creating these spaces. So what I always look for is the willingness to come to that space, and come to that space in the spirit of, those original instructions and those original teachings, especially specifically to that land base, and wanting to learn about what that is.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. I really love that piece of, I think unlearning is like a huge factor in all of this, especially with the colonial structures, being able to kind of just be open-minded to different timelines and things shifting and taking into consideration. just all the various different ways of doing things. But yeah, thank you.
I can go next. I'd love to wait, I was gonna try and thread something that Tiffany had said with Lindsey's incredible comments. I think thinking about what Tiffany, what you said about opening things up in a good way, I think like starting with a lot of intention and reciprocity can be so meaningful and impactful and influence every aspect of a project when there is a willingness to meaningfully engage with an open mind and an open heart. I think that perspectives can shift. Timelines could open up and change if there's a need and a desire for more time and an extra person to be involved, for that to be kind of established as like as a baseline at the beginning of something, that things may change as we move along and progress through a project. I was thinking of a project I worked on earlier in my career where I think, Lindsey, when you said reciprocity, and it made me think of reciprocal relationships, it made me like reflect upon a situation where I felt it was a more extractive relationship, something I'm not prepared to do anymore where I am. But as you know, younger emerging curators, artists, can often be put in positions where we're trying to live or survive and are in situations that are unfair, that where you're not treated with the respect that you deserve. And I think that it's really important for us as artists and cultural workers, facilitators, architects, artists, to not just ask for, but demand a different way of doing things. And that's where we have the agency and the power to shift these systems and structures that have, I guess, been taken for granted or considered commonplace for so long, and where we can bring in elements of, say, natural law or community protocols that we know work, and we know they work because they worked for our ancestors for so long. And I love what Tiffany said about, you know, not only those that came before us, but that will come after us, because it's important that we continue to do that work and open those doors and pave those roads for those that are going to continue on with this work and come after us. So I think having discussions around capacity at the very beginning it's a really important thing for a number of reasons.
I'm sort of two minds, because like what you're saying really got me thinking a little bit about equity, which made me think about the performative. It's easier for me to say what doesn't work than what does. So like it's easy to see when people give land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements is like the easiest one to kind of target, for example, as performative. And but I also think it's really nice that people do land acknowledgement. So it's like I can always tell when someone's just doing a boilerplate land acknowledgement. That would be performative. But at the same time, I keep thinking about where people are in the continuum of information, and some people are still new to the conversation. So that's why it's like easy just to judge than to just like let it rest. So I find land acknowledgements are an easy target, but at the same time, they're still really powerful. because I want to know where people are coming from and whose land I'm on in case I'm new to the territory. So that one I find really tricky. But then when Eli was talking, it made me think a little bit more about equity, which I'm always in this conversation of, do I have a seat at the table when being invited to these places? And I'm never really sure sometimes. I find this maybe one of the more challenging pieces that I work on, including the people that I invite into the conversation. Are we providing equity? And this part, I think, requires more work. Like, I'm an architect and an artist, so people will bring me in as an Indigenous player, but I'm only like an afterthought, just like the land acknowledgement. And I want to talk about so many examples, but I'm just realizing that I get hired in these places, so I can't necessarily talk about a recent grievance, but I find it troubling when people invite me into spaces, make me feel like I have ideas, but don't take any of them. And then when they have a presentation, ask me to present at the top of it. Like, that fucking makes me mad. And it happens a lot. And you think that you're going into a relationship that's reciprocal, and then you start to see the doors narrower and close. And it's like, how do you carve space for yourself and feed your family and look after your parents? And it's exhausting. So the performative thing is an important question, and multi-pronged. So I just think it's better to think about it in terms of generosity than negativity, but it's easy for me just to go to a negative place.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure. I feel like I saw people really thinking. I don't know if they wanted to like add on to that. I feel like this is a really broad question. I'm sure there's a lot of thoughts around it, but I appreciate your thoughts. And yeah, I agree. I think I kind of mentioned before, like around like colonial systems and just like ways of being commonplace, just the ability to be open-minded about unlearning, I think is really important. In terms of like being performative as well, kind of just like taking acknowledgement or being able to be self-aware if you are, and not be defensive, and just kind of having those conversations with people. And yeah, I think the unlearning process is really important to that. And yeah, I think Eli, you had sort of mentioned already, which was kind of going into another question, the importance of having these protocols start at the beginning of the process, like kind of just root the work within this. And I would like for people to kind of just elaborate on the value of that and why it shouldn't be like an afterthought, and why organizations as well as artists should be able to kind of have this protocol or this discussion around these approaches from the very beginning, and kind of just utilize this as a way to create work and create art.
I just want to add to that, actually. I think public art could be seen as performative too, because they'll invite this idea of an Indigenous work or bring an Indigenous person onto the idea, like Eli's talking about, he's working on a larger apartment thing. And so there's like opportunity, but that is also very performative, like just placing artwork there, but not making it integrative into the structure of what's actually happening. People don't want to pull apart their processes. So I find always struggling to do that. But then once you get the work, then the city makes it performative, or the developer makes it performative, where they've placed you. But then they'll ask you questions about how to reduce homelessness with your artwork or drug use. And they'll mine your artwork around policy, which doesn't happen in architecture. No one asks me if my cladding is going to allow people to sleep underneath the cladding and stuff like that. Whereas you actually get that quite frequently under public art. Like, people are policed and they use public art as a device for that. And I think that is performative. Like, I've been really questioning, what is public art for and who is it serving? Which wasn't your question, but it leads into that a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
So that makes me think of process. you know. Like I have a friend on the island who was recently working with school board and municipality where she lives in her community for the construction of a new high school. And I've been thinking of her experience with that and how when you enter into the public art part of that process and the building has already been designed, you are just like slapping feathers and you're just slapping decals on top of how can it actually be integrated? How could you have those conversations about use, you know, in the most robust way possible from the very beginning? And so I have, you know, questions and concerns about yeah, how that's taking place with this, you know, current project that I'm on. And like I think it's these conversations that we have amongst ourselves that really help inform how we're going to enter into these spaces, and how we can advocate from our own experiences, our colleagues and our friends' experiences, what worked, what didn't work. But it makes me think of the I don't know, the importance of slowing down when possible. I know that like you have, yeah, school boards, construction companies, you know, things that are tendered. You have deadlines, timelines, permits. It can be a complicated endeavor with so many different moving parts. But how can we slow things down to have the conversations that we need to have? I was just reflecting on like, I can't tell you how many times this has happened while working at an art gallery or with film, when somebody I'm working with, somebody in their family passes away, and they like we have to stop or pause or postpone, and how common that is, and how much our communities are grieving pretty constantly. And that's something I don't want to focus on, but it's like an important part of like when we're talking about process and timelines, that I'm not going to like, my role as like a curator is to like buffer and support artists from the institution that I'm working with and for, to like shield them from the shit that institutions are made up of, which are like, yeah, timelines, deadlines, deliverables. But these are just some thoughts that are coming to mind.
Thank you. Lindsay, did you want to add to that question?
The importance of it being in the beginning, like the way that I approach it, I can only really speak from my own experiences, right? I've been in those situations where, you know, as a younger artist, you're the afterthought, right? And even to the extent of, you know, outside of art too, you know, trying to come up with, you know, policy that actually is about building relationship with us, right? And even having that afterthought be embedded in that process. So that's an even more like kicker, right? And I think, you know, for me, to the point it is now, that's why I do that as my own protocol and practice, is to ask some really poignant questions in the beginning. And I don't care who I piss off anymore. You know, I really don't. Because that's how I vet if it's worthy for my spirit and for me to show up 100% how I am expected to from my community, right? Because it's a big role. And again, too, it makes me think of all of the artists and the young people that are coming. You know, if we've had a bit of impact to kind of take on some of that and shift that narrative, and also give people a different experience, right? Because some people, sometimes you can't be not diplomatic, but sometimes the truth has to sting for people to get it. And I don't know if that's just my turtle clan talking, really like leaned into my clan responsibilities. But you know, that's kind of how I approach things now. And I can usually tell based off of how people are talking, what their parameters look like. And I ask those questions, right? So yeah, it made me think, right? I definitely can see, and like Eli, that's a very challenging position to be in because you're a bridge, right? And 100% respect for those that are doing that work because it has to be done. But yeah, I mean, I guess I've been known in the community these days to be, if you want the truth, you know, I'll tell you the truth and I'll protect my community and my people at the end of the day. And I don't really care about the dollar. You know, it's unfortunate because that gets hung over our heads a lot. But I've just noticed that that's, you know, it hasn't led to any lack of opportunity. I actually have found, at least in my experience, it's led to more. Because if people really want to get, you know, get to a good place with us as artists, as people, and all different kinds of industries and areas and community, they're gonna have to start stepping up and being uncomfortable, right? That's part of the process, as far as I'm concerned, is being a little uncomfortable while we go through this process, you know? So that's kind of all I have to say about that part of the question.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Yeah.
I totally agree with all the points made. I even wanted to go back to kind of just like what Tiffany was mentioning around just like negative experiences or even the grieving. I think that kind of just like goes back to the uncomfortability and being able to sit in that and being able to work through that, I think is very important. And just my next question was kind of more on like how we can work towards something again, but I think maybe I would shift it more towards your own individual experiences and how you approach your work and how you honor these practices, because we all have different lived experiences, and I think people can learn more from your own approaches to things and how you kind of safeguard yourself, as you were mentioning, Lindsey, in this work, and are able to kind of have those boundaries set as opposed to like a how-to. So I think that would be a good way to kind of just inform artists as well, who are emerging or are newer to public art or kind of approaching this work and also coming from a similar experience where they kind of want to set those boundaries and want to be able to have ceremonies and slow things down and have those conversations, how you're able to honor all of those practices and kind of move forwards within these institutions and still do the work. I shifted the question a bit, but I hope that makes sense.
That's a big one.
Yeah, there was a few different questions in there, I think, and statements and reflections. I'd like to say something. I think something Lindsey just said made me really think. Yeah, being uncomfortable, the discomfort. In my therapy sessions, I often talk about that. That's where the growth is in discomfort, is when you're uncomfortable to really like dig into that. Like, why are you uncomfortable? That, I think, in this type of work, that's where people can really grow. And if they're, like Lindsey said before too, listening and learning, if they are able to do that simultaneously and like really come with an open heart, then I think that is where things can change. On the flip side of that, I think when you bring up the word boundaries, I think it makes me think of when we recognize where it's too uncomfortable or there's too much discomfort or things are off balance. Going back to like discussing like board structures, when things are too top down or bureaucratic and there's no wiggle room at all to like, okay, maybe if, you know, an organization, an institution, a person, if you're uncomfortable and can't work in that situation, to step back, to step away. But I think it's so case by case, and I think it is different when you're starting out. I know that I endured things 5 years ago that I wouldn't even consider now. And I think it's important for us to continue making space within these ecosystems for different practices, policies, processes to become a norm, or for there to be just discussions about different ways of doing things.
Yeah, it was a really big question. So I think we'd all answer it differently. I think it goes back to, and I wanted to say it too when we talked about protocol, but Eli brought it up so succinctly, process. When things are uncomfortable, it's like you want to go to solutions. But if you trust the process, it's a way of finding new solutions, I think. And I think that's the point of being uncomfortable, is it's an opportunity. You know, things are not working generally in a lot of the places that we are in. The structures are set one way, but it just doesn't kind of work for another thing. And so just having to remember that we can work on an assumption of what we can do versus what we can't. And what we can do is feel uncomfortable to explore new potentials. Because sort of like there's some answers in that. Like when you just do status quo, there's comfortability in that because there's, you know, a way to operate. But then the result doesn't always really nourish you or nourish your community. So you kind of have to go back at it. So that's what's nice about the uncomfortability. Also, I find in particular to Indigenous communities, like if you're not uncomfortable, then you're not doing the work, because there's just so many realities to face. Like if I'm not getting an angry email like once a week, it's like, what am I doing with my life? So not like an angry email, but like if I'm not being corrected by an elder, or if I'm not being repositioned, I'm not doing my job to serve the community. There's just a lot of humility built into that practice. But I was in a sweat last week and I found it, I know this is all very personal, but I don't mind sharing this particular thing, because when I'm uncomfortable, I just move my body. I get up or I express myself. I have no problem telling people what I think. It's very easy for me to be communicative in that way. But like in a sweat, I had to be quiet. I had to sit there in the dark with several people, and like this idea of no escape. Like I can of course ask to leave, but I want to make it through. And that means I couldn't do the things that I do all the time, which is to move and express myself. I had to sit there and listen. And they give the pretense before, like things will get uncomfortable. Sit with that uncomfortability. And that's a lesson. And I found it very difficult. I was like a mess for 3 rounds. And then come the 4th round, everything was totally fine. And so for like, we all need uncomfortability all the time. And it's nice to have barriers that push up against you, because you're like, what's working, what's not working, and why. And it just gives you opportunity to shift and reset, or zoom out or zoom in. And that's how I would answer that. You had asked about how do you safeguard against what you do. I mean, I loved how Eli said he's taking opportunities differently 5 years from before. So that's, everyone will do that. But I always say I have a work-life flow, not a work-life balance. But it can get messy that way. Like if I don't create structures, I'm debilitating myself. So a lot of the things that I've been telling myself lately that may or may not be helpful is like, not only just metaphorically watering my own garden, but actually watering my own garden has been very helpful. Like, how can you be in the soil, or how can you have a land-based practice in an urban context? You know, how can you give yourself space and rest? Because I don't think I'm the only one. People have a hard time saying no. And that's their own internal struggle on how we all solve that. But I think watering my own garden has been the thing that I've been telling myself a lot for the last 2 years.
Love that. Thank you. Any other thoughts, Lindsay? I know it's a huge open-ended question, but
My mind's just going to knowing myself of where my threshold is of where I'm willing to teach
Mhm.
is a big part of it, and what my capacity is to do it as well. And is there a recognition coming from that other party, the other the other stakeholder, whatever it is, person, is there a respect in that, right? Of even saying, this is where I'm willing to go. Are you willing to meet me? And when we're talking about, being uncomfortable, because really what's happening when we're engaging in a lot of different spaces is, and I think that we don't talk about this enough, is that Indigenous people, we mirror back a lot of issues. Not in the sense that there's issues with us, but there's, especially with the rise of us, right? And more of us that are actually holding those boundaries, are coming back to our worth, right? Coming back to, how we take up space, reclaiming the way we even steward land, right? Stepping back into our responsibilities. There's so many more than there has ever been. So you get into those spaces, and what's happening is you trigger people, right? There's a trigger happening. And so I've learned over, the years to just be mindful with myself of, how, and conscious of how much am I willing to do, right? To help guide this other, this other side of the picture here. And at what point is that time where I have to turn around and remind that person or that, entity, the other part of that relationship, that they have work to do. That's not my work, right? And that's kind of hard. That's hard to tell people that. And it's not so much that it's hard for me to do it, it's hard for the other person to listen and hear that, right? And then, but on the positive, it's a big opportunity to leverage the knowledge that we have in navigating those spaces, because we have things baked right into our nationhood that, come down to things like conflict resolution, condolences for grieving, ceremonies that are made to support that individual's spirit as they move through uncomfortability. We knew that very well, right? So that's what I'm always mindful of is, again, back to that receptivity, that reciprocity, are you willing to step into that space? So, yeah, and I echo Eli too. There's a lot of places that I just don't, I can tell just with practice, and really working on, the healing part of reconnecting with connection is another big piece, because we live in a society that's main function is disconnection. So I see it as, Indigenous creators, we're bridges to creation, and we're also bridges to cultivating connection. So even just by existing in that space, when we show up, we inevitably do that. So it's really about getting to know, again, your capacity and evaluating what that other person's capacity is to meet you in that space. It's from my experience.
Thank you. Yeah, I mentioned it, but I think, your own personal lived experience is so valued. And I feel like I appreciate it getting personal and you sharing that, because I think that's significant for a lot of people to hear and understand from that approach. Something Tiffany said too around how you can have like a land-based practice in an urban context, I think really leads into the conversation we had around decolonization, which is also another huge question that we'll end on before we open to other guest questions. But I'm really interested to kind of have this conversation around how and if we can decolonize colonial spaces. That was sort of the discussion that we were having, and you wanted to share your thoughts, and I'm eager to hear them. So, yeah. I don't know if you want to start us off, Lindsey. You seem
So that question is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. I don't know. I honestly don't know. And the more time I spend having conversations specifically about, like reconciliation per se, just generally, broadly, take the art context out of it, I just don't know. Because again, going back to the structures that are in existence, in many cases, if not all cases that I'm seeing, they're in direct conflict with our ways of being, right? Even down to how we care for ourselves and how we care for our communities. Often than not, there's hardly ever any space allotted for that. But I will say, from my experience working with, organizations that have started to implement some of the practices that we have. Now, they're never going to be 100% because that's the other part of it, is that, being part of a nation, being a part of a circle of people is also, in a sense, reserved for those people, right? Because there, and again, I think about this bad boy. I got it right here. I think about this, right? Think about the 2-row and about how that really is talking about those boundaries. And yeah, we can visit, right? And that's kind of what we're doing. Indigenous people are visiting spaces, non-Indigenous people are visiting spaces that are Indigenous spaces. But again, it's always that recognition of the boundary. And that really comes down to, again, like outlining the reciprocity, ensuring that it's there, right? But long and short of it, I'm not sure. I really question that a lot these days.
Yeah, it's not a question I'm sure we'll answer today, but I'm just eager to hear people's thoughts on it and kind of just open up this space to kind of discuss it and have conversations around it. Even if it's just a starting point, like we said, to kind of just like open up and the space and slow down and kind of just sit in uncomfortability and have the hard conversations or
Bonjour, everyone. Can you hear me? Sorry to come in late. My name is Shiukwat, which means fast-moving cloud. I'm from Amjanaw, Sarnia. I'm sorry, I was at another meeting and I really wanted to be here for this one. I think with the decolonization, we know that will never happen. But we can make a difference in how they decolonize us. And we can actually start to colonize them in certain ways with our art. And I believe, having our murals or our paintings, our teachings, we as artists, we are the knowledge keepers of our traditions and our culture. And putting that out there makes a huge difference for educating non-Indigenous people as well as re-educating the Indigenous people, because there's a lot of Indigenous people that don't know much about our culture, such as 60 scoopers and even residential school survivors. And there's so many of us that all of us have been affected by some aspect of that, of our past, and having to move forward with all these arts that we have I believe is the language of what the times are at this time and where we're going with our art towards re-educating everybody in community. And I was very fortunate that, it is happening. Things are moving forward. I was at an Indigenous cancer program. That's the Toronto Central Regional Indigenous Cancer Program, put out a ceremony bundle toolkit to help with hospice people. And part of that is not only just the bundle, it's also about re-educating them with the arts. And our arts they say our language is our traditions, and it's our traditions are stored in our language, as well as it's also stored in our arts. And, you know, the people that are doing the arts, getting it out there is really important, you know. And I believe Emily Kagishik, who's an incredible artist, she just did a hospice in Saugeen, and she painted the whole wall. And you know, it's a beautiful tribute to the Indigenous people that are passing on and to the spirit world. So I think those places that we can get our art and our culture into different regions, different buildings, municipal, you know, it's getting our stuff out there as much as possible in order for everyone to say, well, I can't ignore this. What's this about? That's when questions start to be asked. And I believe that's what we do as artists. You know, I'm an artist. I sell so many of my Indigenous art prints, and I just want to, I don't even care if I make money off it. I just want to get it out there so that people will ask questions about it. What's this about? And that's how we re-educate everyone. And it's, you know, I know there's the dark season of truth and reconciliation, and I know we have to go through that process. And, you know, I work with Indigenous school boards, and, you know, we have about, in my county where I'm on here in Perth County and Ontario here, we have about 650 kids in the school system, and only 250 are self-identified. And that tells you something, that they're afraid to identify themselves because of what's happened in our past. And I believe our art is a thing to actually give pride back into our culture, pride back into our people. And I think, you know, the more we get it out there, the better it's going to be, and it's gonna ruffle feathers, and that's okay. But you know, I think we're in a place now that non-Indigenous people are wanting the stuff there. And, you know, like Eli said, you know, you have to be careful because, you know, some of it's just policy or face quoting of making themselves look good. But you know what? I don't care, as long as we get it out there and it gets out there and people start asking questions, and that's.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to thank you so much for your thoughts. This was kind of just the last question for the panelists. I just wanted to make sure they had space to kind of give thoughts before we open it up to audience questions. But if you wanted to elaborate on that and ask a question, then I'll add to that as well. But thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but thank you for your thoughts. Yeah, I just wanted to hold space for you all to also answer that question before we open it up for other audience questions and make sure people have time.
Can you remind me of what the root question was? I just wanted to make sure I understood the root question.
Yeah, no worries. It was sort of just like an open-ended broad question around how we could, if we could, begin to decolonize colonial spaces.
Yeah, and I think what I loved about that last participant, I forgot their name. I'm so sorry, because it says Kristen's phone, but I really appreciated their contribution, because it made me think a little bit about, I so resist the decolonized reconciliation question because I'm struggling to find my place within it. And I liked how Lindsey kind of responded there too about how we're just sorting it out, because I think about, it's easier for me to think about how it happens in my family, because I can understand that. So one thing I try my hardest to be conscious of is that I'm white passing, and that my experience is very urban. So, because I've grown up in cities. And I also try to be cautious because Métis people are of two worlds, as we know, but sometimes it's leaning more towards one than the other, I find. So I'm sometimes worried that I'm like a navigator, but for the wrong group of people. So that decolonize question makes me wonder where we check our privilege in that conversation. And I think a lot about how when we were younger growing up, we always knew we were Métis, which is a privilege because not everybody knew that. But we never talked about it openly in the family. We always talked about how we had European connections and how, because we knew that's what was well received outside of our family. And while we were getting our Métis membership or M&A status, it was only then that the family started to talk about their pride in being harvesters. Like, we had a trapline, of course, but it wasn't like something that we talked about as a pride. It was just like a function. And now at the table, we talk about the importance of our voice in these spaces and the lens that we bring to it, which is just so different from when I was growing up. And seeing mostly my mother, who has passed away, how she comes to being Native is really important to me, because she raised us in the city to get away from being scrutinized, being racially, like, we were never dark enough or never light enough, of course, and that's its own kind of thing. And so the solution for her was just to remove us from that conversation. And then she would say, you're lucky that you go to a school where there is diversity, because there wasn't diversity where I was growing up. Is either you were Native or you were white. And so she had to really hide a part of herself. And growing up in school, it wasn't really something you shared too often. Usually people would like confess it, and then nothing was really discussed about it. And so I think a lot about how our family comes to being Indigenous and what is important for us to experience. But there's certain things that happens that like makes my heart cry, which is like when my daughter sings songs in Cree, there's just something that connects me back to listening to my great-grandmother speaking to me, or speaking on tapes that my grandma would record. There's something that moves my body when you're outside and like listening to the landscape that makes me feel like I'm connecting back to my family and to like a natural way of being. And so while I don't like the decolonized question, it's an important one, but I think it's because we're still just kind of like navigating. But I love what that last person said about the season of truth and reconciliation. I think that's interesting to note, that like this is a moment, and that it has a, might end eventually, or like there's, I just like that it's not a forever thing in the way that they said that. So I thought that was beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, go ahead, Eli.
Is there time for me to say something?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to first thank the person who spoke before, Tiffany, for joining the circle. You had some really beautiful things to offer to this, and it makes me think of when we do have more voices around the table, more minds and hearts a part of these conversations, just how much more rich it becomes. I wish we had another hour and a half. Talking with Lindsey and Tiffany has been a real joy. And it makes me think of, I love how you're bringing it back to your family, Tiffany. It makes me think of how that reclaiming has happened in my own family. How my mom's a 60s scoop survivor. I grew up away from community. It's been a challenging and beautiful journey to go home and to take part in ceremony and build relationships with family and community. I know that when I'm there, and last summer my mom and I got to do a sweat back home for the first time. It's all I wanted for my 40th birthday. I told my mom was for us to be in ceremony together. And I know that's we're healing behind us and in front of us when we're doing things like that. I felt compelled to share that. The decolonizing institutions or organizations, or how that takes place, I am stepping away from a non-Indigenous arts organization and have really intentionally chosen to work with an Indigenous-led advocacy organization. That's coming from a situation where in the artist-run center landscape, I was in a very good position. Our gallery had an elder in residence, which no other artist-run centers across the country have. but there are just a lot of challenges when you're working with boards and systems and funders where there's just an expected way to be. And there's an amount of change we can make within those spaces, but that does entail the folks that comprise those organizations also doing the requisite work and labor to do that. I think that it brings me back to the reciprocity, how important that is. Discussion around allies versus accomplices. Like, are you, yeah, how down are you for change? You know, I was just, Tiffany, as you were talking, I was just thinking of like how it felt for me to be in Edmonton last weekend, and how within like a couple of blocks, I couldn't go to Otsitiwan or the Art Gallery of Alberta, but I'm just thinking, like, you being core at Otsitiwan, how different that gallery operates than the AGA. And then there's this other building right down the street, the Edmonton Public Library, where I did go and I sat with Elder Joanne Saddleback, who is a really important person to me in my life, and how like important elders are in these conversations, and their presence and their guidance, and how I've seen through a friend who works closely with Joanne, like how much change is able to happen from within when you have somebody like Joanne telling you what you need to do. And it's not like asking you, it's like this is the way it's going to be. And how powerful and transformative that is.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I wish I could ask a million follow-up questions and go deeper and deeper into this conversation. But in time, I think we have maybe 2 questions that we can answer from the audience. So if you could raise your hand or pop it into the chat, I can read it aloud as well. And then we'll just end on that note. But thank you so much for sharing all of that. Also the personal stories about family, I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Can I chime in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Ani Bushu, my name is Shiukwat, Fast Moving Cloud. My name is Kristen Dennis is my Christian name. And it's always hard to go by that name because I was given Shiukwat when I was on the community. I almost said reserve, which is, we don't call them that anymore. And I'm from the old school. I am a 60 scoop survivor. And, for me to be in this place of sharing and being able to share knowledge with kids, I go into schools and I talk to kids all the time. I've been doing that for 7 years now. And I had no idea that a person as such as myself that came through such a hard life. And Tiffany, I know what it's like to live in 2 worlds. And I think that's one of the benefits if you're a 60 scoop survivor, or if you're Métis, or even if you're residential school. I mean, every Indigenous person lives in 2 worlds right now. And I'm pretty sure of that. And, we are the bridges to actually bridge everyone together to create community. I know in our stories about the medicine wheel that we knew about Europeans and the red, yellow, black, and white, that they were all supposed to come together, and we're all supposed to share our gifts with each other. And if we ever used our gifts against each other, there'd be thousands of years of war, which I'm pretty sure we're seeing right now. But I also believe we're at a precipice because we live in a great country called Canada, North America, Turtle Island. And we have all races here living together, and we're sharing our gifts. And, we're actually in a good place to actually show the world that it can be done. And we're on the precipice of change. And in our prophecies, they talk about the change of sharing our gifts together, that there would be thousands of years of peace. And I believe we're at a precipice. Unfortunately, a precipice can last 1,000 years, or it could last a day. Who knows? I just know that I'm doing the work. We have to do the work. We have to get our stuff out there. And I do everything that I can. And, you know, it's because of my art. That's why I'm going into schools and talking to the children. And, the funny people who I'm teaching mostly are non-Indigenous people. And the more they learn about our ways, this is the next generation that they're going to be, I'm hoping will be a household name, that we won't be segregated, and conversations and stuff like that, that will just be part of everything. And I believe that's going to happen. And I feel very privileged that, that we can do that. So I don't know where that was going, but blah, blah, blah. But I feel really privileged to be here with you guys. So thanks for allowing me to chime in.
Yeah, it was beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. If there's any other questions, let me know. I might read some of these comments, which are very beautiful. If there's any questions that come up, please feel free to raise your hand. There's a comment from Jessica that says, "Thank you for all your words today. I really appreciate it. I feel validated in my own work and how I feel about my current work as well. These discussions are so important to have, especially for people like me to witness. I'm going to leave with lots to think about, and also I think the continued dedication to doing the work that makes who I work for uncomfortable." Jennifer also wrote, "Don't give up on big institutions. Change may be super, super, super slow, but the little bit of goodness that does get accomplished can go a long way in the committees we serve. Never doubt a small group of thoughtful people can change the world indeed." Lastly, another comment from Brent. "Thanks everyone for the important discussion. Super useful for the communities in which I work out west, where people are very active in setting protocols, sometimes quite different to their neighbors. I'm not seeing a lot of extreme discomfort in project development, but more increasing care and slowing down interactions to fully discuss needs and issues, which often doubles the time it takes to develop a project. If there was more time, I'd ask about strategies about working with arts administrators who believe they're sincere but haven't done the work to know now, or to dialogue with Native artists," which is another panel discussion. I think, yeah, thank you all for the lovely comments. There's a lot of really nice comments coming in. So I'm just going to end it on that note. I'm sorry we couldn't take any other questions, but I want to honor everyone's time and thank the panelists once again for their time. I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you to the engagement team and our staff for helping out with tech on the back end, as well as our ASL interpreters, Tessa and Jordan, for all of their support tonight. And lastly, I want to thank our funders, Canada Council for the Arts, TD Bank Group, the TD Ready Commitment, and the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. But yeah, thank you all so much for tuning in as well. This has been such an honor to be a part of this conversation and just facilitate this. So again, thank you so much, Eli, Lindsey, and Tiffany, for all of your thoughts and your contributions to this. We really appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their day or evening, wherever they're joining from. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Belinda.
Miigwech, Nyao.
It was great to be with you, Lindsey and Eli. Looking forward to more.
Yeah, same.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.